You know, what's interesting is how things have changed from when we were children. I was born in 1959, so I grew up in the 1960s and 70s during the Cold War. And, you know, so many Americans were afraid that a loss of liberty that we sensed was in Russia, the Soviet Union, that there wasn't the freedoms, and that there was suppression and authoritarianism and things like that. Those were the main reasons why people were opposed to it. And now, in our own country, it's really changed. It's really changed to where probably somebody who lived in the Soviet Union and came to America, I'm suspecting that they think this is becoming very, it's similar to what it was in the Soviet Union.
It's the same, like all those mandates,
mandates and things. It's got to be frightening for you.
Yeah, it is, because we know what it will come to.
Right.
Dr. Galiuzza, president of the Institute for Creation Research, academic speaker presenting the biblical view of origins. Dr. Galiuzza has a BS in engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, a BA in theology from Moody Bible Institute, an MD from the University of Minnesota, and a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. Also, he is an author of multiple books and publications in areas of creationism and medicine.
Dr. Galiuzza, thank you for coming to us today, for agreeing to do this interview. I think it'll be very interesting to our listeners, Russian-speaking audience around the world. Tell us a little bit about the Institute for Creation Research that you are a CEO right now, right?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And we had a wonderful time this morning in church with the Russian-speaking population. The Institute for Creation Research, as the name implies, is a research organization that researches areas of geology and biology to find scientific evidences which confirm what the Bible says in terms of creation, that the creation was relatively recent, within the last 6,000, 6,500 years, that it happened in 6 literal days, not figurative times, but literal days, that there was an instantaneous creation of Adam and then Eve from him, and that there was a worldwide flood, just as described in the Bible. If all of those things were true, and they were, then they should have left some marks all around the world that we can discover. And our organization exists to discover those scientific evidences. We've been in existence for over 50 years. It started in 1970 by Dr. Henry M. Morris, with the primary purpose of using science to confirm the Bible and pointing out the scientific fallacies and problems with the dominant view of evolutionary thinking. So we have a twofold ministry, and that is to confirm the Bible and to show the problems with evolutionary thinking.
But what do you do? Do you travel around the world and speak about it? Do you publish some materials, or do you just do research?
Well, we do all three. We do a lot of research. We have a staff of PhD geologists who do research, and they travel around and they do geological research in collaboration with others of other ministries. And we also do biological research. We have several large experiments that we're doing right now in-house with our staff geneticist, and we'll have an embryologist on staff. We have a zoologist, parasitologist. I'm a medical doctor. So we have a staff of people who do live research around the world. So that's step number one. And then step two is to publish those materials. And we publish them both in scientific journals. There are several scientific journals which your readers may be interested in that publish strictly creation research. They're peer-reviewed, and one's called the Journal of Creation, and the other is the Creation Research Society Quarterly, in case they want to look those up. And that publishes in the scientific realm, but we also do popular publishing as well through our own magazine, Acts and Facts, which is a monthly journal and very popular magazine as well. Well over 100,000 people take the hard copy, and another 100,000 people look at it online. So quite a large reading audience of that. And we get that literature out that way. And then, of course, we have to publicize it verbally. And so we go to various places like we came here today, and we do conferences and seminars. Sometimes we'll go to college universities and speak to the students there and maybe even do a debate.
Do they invite you, or do you invite yourself?
Oh, we get invited.
Okay.
It's hard to crash right into the college campus, so we get invited.
When we lived in the Soviet Union, I came to US when I was 12 years old. So I got to go to school a little bit in the former Soviet Union. And the only theory that was taught was Darwin's theory of creation of the Earth existence. And when I came to US, I found, at least in my science classes, several theories were presented. Darwin's theory, and then alternative theories, and then the creation theory, along all others. Has it changed over time? Why do you think it's important to talk about these things? If all the theories are presented equally and people can just choose, why do you feel the need that you need to go out and debate those things?
Well, it's important to debate for the reason that you just mentioned, that people need to hear alternative explanations. If you only hear one explanation, then it's like a type of indoctrination, and it really isn't education. In education, you should be presented multiple ideas, multiple explanations, so that people can consider it. Now, what's interesting is, in the United States, we compared ourselves to the former Soviet Union in the sense that they had more academic freedom than you would have thought here. Yes, and it's a little different maybe. In the United States, through the early grade through high school, just like in the Soviet Union and many other countries, the young people get taught really just one view predominantly, which is the Darwinian evolutionary view of origins. They get exposed a little bit more to creation views, or another group called intelligent design view. But then, ironically, the academic freedom switches. And then when you get into higher education in the United States, it swaps. And people can get in a lot of trouble in the United States at the upper echelons for trying to teach other views. In other words, a professor could lose his job and other areas, whereas in the, at least in the Soviet Union, I suppose maybe in Russia now, there's a little more openness to discuss at the college level alternative views. And there isn't quite the hostility that people and academics would face in the United States here.
Even if they don't present it as a fact, but just as another view to consider?
Oh, yes. That's really important. Even if they don't present it as a fact, but even as another view, that professor in the United States could easily lose his job, easily get fired, easily have grant money to fund his research withdrawn, and face some kind of retribution in many ways, even if they just put the idea out as something for the students to consider. In the United States, there is very, very little academic freedom at the collegiate level and beyond, and their fellow teachers and professors really have ways of punishing other academics who don't toe, as you might have said, the party line. So in the United States, academic freedom is very limited at the college level.
Wow. Did it just start recently, or was it since the 1950s? Is that when you were founded?
Well, we were founded in 1970, about 50 years ago. It's gotten worse since the 1970. But it's always been there. There's been a strong resistance to teaching alternative views on this for long before our ministry even got started. But early on, in the early days of our ministry, in the early 1970s and up through about the mid-1980s, we were able to go on college campuses quite readily And we were engaging in academic debates. In fact, one of the founders of our ministry engaged in over 300 debates with professors over that time, quite a few.
Oh, yeah.
And he won almost all of them. And then the word got out that you don't want to debate, that they don't just present the Bible alone, and they don't just present religion, but they actually have very good scientific evidence for their view. So then the debate stopped. And about the time that the debate stopped, all discussion on this was pretty much stifled, in other words, suppressed. So that is one way of keeping the views out, is to not even allow discussions of any type on the campuses. How it happens today, as you mentioned, we get invited. We generally get invited by one of the Christian groups on campus who will invite us to come on. And we do usually a seminar there of some type. And even then, sometimes professors from the university show up very angry, very hostile. You can tell they're very upset when they come just to hear the seminar.
Is your main purpose to talk to unchristians about the creation view, to make unchristians believe, or make Christians who believe in the Darwinian theory believe? Because as I understand, or maybe if I'm wrong, correct me, it doesn't affect our salvation, right? If we believe in Darwin's theory, or it does?
No, ma'am, it doesn't. It doesn't affect our salvation at all. In fact, when I became a Christian, I believed in evolution, because the people who presented the Lord Jesus to me talked about my sin and my need for a Savior and my need to turn to the Lord Jesus for forgiveness of my sins, which I did. But I was a very trusting student, and I trusted my professors. I trusted my teachers quite a bit, and I was taught evolution. And I also thought that only the smart people believed in evolution. And people who really weren't quite as academically aware or acquainted, they held to creation. So there was a pride issue in it as well, which still is out there for a lot of people. And so I came to believe in the Lord Jesus, even believing in evolution. And it wasn't until several years later that I read information actually from this ministry in the library that changed my life. I read some things and it made scientific sense, and it was like being born again a second time in there. But our ministry has also changed over time. When we were initially founded, our ministry was primarily to unsaved people. We would reach out and try to knock down the barriers for them to come to the Lord Jesus, because they thought science had disproved the Bible, or maybe they believed science had disproved that there was a God. And so we would use scientific information to show that those things were not true, that the Bible was reliable, that there was good reasons to believe in God based on the design that we see in nature. But unfortunately, that ministry has changed in the last 50 years to where now a lot of our ministry is actually to the church. Because when we were initially founded, many people in the church were very hungry to get the answers to the questions. But in the last 50 years, much of the church has already changed their view to where they are thinking, well, maybe they can accommodate evolution. And so now really a lot of our ministry is to the church and to local churches.
Why is it important for a Christian to believe, say, in a 7-day creation?
Well, because the Bible teaches it pretty plainly in the first 2 chapters of Genesis.
And if they don't, they won't lose their salvation. So why is it?
Well, because we want to believe that the Bible is accurate in every area that it touches on. And you're right, it's not a salvation issue, and people are not going to lose their salvation for this. But when people begin to doubt that the Bible is true or that it's accurate, then doubts arise in many other areas.
If you doubt in one thing, then you can doubt in many others.
Right.
More fundamental.
And if the Bible was incorrect in one area, then maybe it's incorrect in others.
Very important. So what is the most challenging aspect have your purpose to the modern world, what is the most difficult thing to do for your institute? I would say, what is the most difficult theory to debate?
Well, what's the most difficult to debate? I could look at that in two areas. One, I could look at it from the biblical standpoint, and what's the most difficult challenge is what we would call is the doctrine of clarity or biblical clarity. There's a fancy name for it called perspicuity, which means that the Bible is inherently clear, that God communicated it in a way that everybody could understand. And you don't have to be a scientist, or you don't have to be a theologian to understand the Bible, but that the average ordinary person can read it and understand it for themselves, which is very important, because that way the Holy Spirit teaches directly to individual people. So biblical clarity says that the Bible is clear without the need of a priest or a holy man or a scientist to be in between the Bible and you to interpret it for you. And that's really hard to get across to people because, one, I think they want to have someone tell them what the Bible says. It's very easy to just say, well, I'll just listen to what they say, I'll listen to what they say, without having to think for yourself. So there's this natural inclination to take the easy way out. Two, there's a lot of pressure from the world on Christians that they want to be thought of as intellectual and they want to be thought of as smart. And as I mentioned earlier, people think that anybody who believes the Bible isn't very intellectual or isn't very smart. So they want to be told what to say by a scientist. So our biggest challenge in the church is to have people understand that biblical clarity is important. The words mean what they mean. You can give the words their normal meaning and their normal context and have it speak directly to you without the need for someone to tell you what it is. It's not really science. It relates to how we're going to approach the Bible and how we're going to interpret the Bible.
Right. So can you, as a Christian, legit believe that the earth was started, or that God used Big Bang to create the earth, or not, as a Christian?
Yes.
Could we as Christians believe that God just used the Big Bang to create the earth?
I would say that we as Christians should not say that God used the Big Bang to create the universe and the earth and things like that.
Just because we would not be believing the Bible?
Primarily, yes. There's several reasons for that. One, it sounds like we should be able to believe it because, before the Big Bang, there maybe was nothing. Who knows? That nobody knows what was before the Big Bang. That's why it's the Big Bang and bringing things into existence. And it sounds like there was a beginning, and maybe God used that to bring things into existence. But when you really understand what the Big Bang is teaching, it's not teaching a spontaneous creation of the universe as the Bible teaches it, where God spoke and it was, and He brought things into existence which did not previously exist. And in addition to that, there are many scientific problems with the Big Bang themselves. So from a scientific standpoint, there are a lot of weaknesses with Big Bang theory that we would consider, and from a biblical standpoint, it's really not fitting with the biblical description of creation as mentioned in the Bible on multiple occasions, where God spoke and things came into existence and that they were fully formed in many ways right from the beginning, whereas Big Bang has the Big Bang, and then it has a long process of evolution that has started about 13.5 billion years ago and is actually still continuing up into the present.
I guess the ultimate question is, can you scientifically prove the 7-day creation, or do you still need an element of faith to believe in it? Or can you just purely scientifically prove the 7-day creation?
No, the answer to that is you cannot scientifically prove 7-day creation. You need faith, and you need biblical revelation. You need faith in biblical revelation. Scientifically, we can show very good evidence that the earth is young, that it is not billions of years old. We can show scientifically that there is very good evidence that there was a worldwide flood from the geological record. We can show scientifically that the human race is not old. We can look at genetics from the Y chromosome for men and from mitochondrial DNA for women. And we can show scientifically that the ages are not long period of time as alleged by evolutionists, but we can't prove that it was exactly 6,500 years ago, to use a round number. We can't prove that it was exactly in 6 literal days, as the Bible says. That is where you need biblical revelation that tells us that information, because you're not going to get it directly from the scientific research.
But then if you can prove scientifically that the earth is young, for example, then you would, that's exactly what the Bible tells us, correct? Right. And that you would believe all the other things that are in the Bible. Is that your purpose?
Yes, that's part of the purpose. It doesn't, what's interesting is we use the word prove, and it's really hard to prove certain things scientifically. I find better proof from the biblical record than actually from the scientific record. But you're right. When we look at the scientific evidence, it indicates that the earth is young, it indicates that the human race is young, and it provides confirmation that the biblical accounts are true accounts. So it confirms those biblical accounts.
What would you say to a person that believes that we came from a common ancestor? Would your arguments be more based on science or on faith?
Well, it would be based on both, because as a Christian, we would say that we did come from a common ancestor, and that would be Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve was the common ancestor for all human beings. And so we as even creationists and Christians would hold to common ancestry, that the common ancestor was Adam and Eve for all of us. Where we differ from the evolutionists is that they hold to universal common ancestry, that there was a universal common ancestor for not only humans, but for every other kind of creature as well.
Yeah.
And so that's universal common ancestry. And I would say there is not good, hard scientific evidence for that. The evidence that they have is very inferential, filled in with a lot of imagination. So in terms of common ancestry, as creationists, we would say there's a common ancestor for humans, there's common ancestor for horses, there's a common ancestor for dogs, and in some types there may be multiple common ancestors depending on how you split them out. But every kind of creature had a common ancestor, but not a universal common ancestor tying them all together.
Yeah, but they do have their arguments that they use. For example, this morning you talked about Lucy, one of the earliest fossil skeletons that is believed to be 3.2 million or billion years old. How would you explain her if she wasn't the common ancestor or universal common ancestor? Who was she?
Okay, who was Lucy?
Yeah.
And that Lucy, by all indications, was an ape on that. And when you look at the fossils, they actually divide very neatly into ape-like fossils and human-like fossils. And there's not really a bridge or a common ground in between each of those fossils. So if you were to look at humans and Neanderthals, for instance, they group clearly into the human category. And then if you look at fossils like Lucy and another one called Ida, which has fallen off the scene, and another one called Artie, these fossils group very clearly into an ape category. Right there, there's an anatomical evidence that they were clearly apes. They lived in trees. They were not habitual upright walkers, and they were not on their way to becoming human.
And they're not 3.2 million years old.
And they're not that old. They're clearly not that old as well.
Okay.
Эволюционисты оперируют радиоуглеродным анализом, говорят, что вот при этих анализах там миллионы лет Земля, миллионы лет.
Okay, radiocarbon dating is probably used by evolutionists and those who hold to a very long age of the Earth as their best evidence for it. You can't really get it by just looking at the layers in the rock, which look like they were placed very, very quickly. So they date rocks through radiometric dating. And the way the system is set up, because they look at elements that are breaking down into different elements, and that's called decay. And the amount of time it takes for half the element to break down is a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. And even if you're off by a little bit in your measurements, a very small amount, it's going to give you very, very vast ages for it. And there's another type of dating which is used for carbon, and that's radiocarbon dating, which doesn't date anywhere near as long of time. And by all radiocarbon dates, we see that there's evidence that these creatures out there, carbon dating and for other things they're dating, are not nearly as old as they are, because the rate at which half of that material breaks down is only about 5,700 years, 5,730 years to be precise. And so after about 50,000 to 100,000 years, there shouldn't be any detectable carbon-14 in these samples that they're testing. But they do find it. And they find it at levels which cannot be explained. And so it actually is indicating that these samples are not nearly as old as they claim. Much, much younger, by orders of magnitude younger than they're claiming them to be. So radiocarbon dating is actually a good tool that young Earth people can use, because the fact that we can still detect it altogether. But probably one of the best arguments against radiometric dating altogether is that when radiometric dating of rocks is used on rocks that we know their age, in other words, we see the volcano erupt, we know when the volcano erupted, based on human history within the last several hundred years, and we test those rocks, we do not get an age anywhere close to what it should be. We get ages that are off by orders of magnitude, 10, 100, 1,000 times higher than they should be. For instance, not too far from here is Mount St. Helens. And when it erupted in 1980, we know that date. And we had samples tested of when they should be dated. And we know what their age was. And when we got them back from the laboratories, they came in with a range of anywhere from 24 million to 30 million years old. 24 to 30 million years old. And I could show you example after example where dates on 8 rocks of known ages do not come anywhere close to what they're coming back on. So if you can't trust it on rocks where you know the ages and it's wrong, why trust it on rocks where you can't?
Right. So it's really not reliable.
I don't think it's a reliable method.
Wow. Thank you. You are an author of a book about human body, as I understand. It's called Made in His Image. As you studied human body initially, not when you were writing a book, but you're also a medical doctor, so you did a lot of studies on this. What amazed you the most about the human body?
Oh, boy, that's a really good question, because I went to medical school having been an engineer. So I understood design when I went to med school, and all of the physiology about how the systems work was extremely interesting to me and fascinating. And I could clearly see very intricately designed systems that were highly regulated. So in a very, very broad sense, physiology was my area of greatest interest. I liked anatomy, like all the parts and how they work together. And then probably the area that I liked best in physiology was reproduction, human reproduction. It's an area where it has direct application to evolution, because in order for evolution to happen, you have to have multiple generations. So you have to have parents and offspring, and then they become parents, and then they have offspring. So you have to have this multiple generation in order for evolution to happen. But with human reproduction, it is so complicated, so intricately complicated, in order to get conception to even happen, that it is a large challenge to evolution. The development from a stem cell to a sperm, how fertilization takes place, lots of barriers that have to be overcome in order for a sperm to fertilize an egg, and then in order for that to implant, and then to begin to develop and to grow, and then how baby from a single cell builds itself. Baby is a self-constructing creature that takes raw materials that mom is providing. Mom's providing all this raw material. It's going into the uterus, and baby is taking these building materials and building itself to a complete human being on that. And baby is sending signals to mom's body, saying, I need this, I need that, give me these things. And then when it's time for baby to be born, baby sends signals to mom's body, say, okay, it's time to be born. And the whole process happens. And if this did not work, then there would not be offspring, and evolution would come to a halt. And so the whole mechanism of human reproduction, I can clearly say, is really intelligently designed. And from a Christian, it's a miraculous system.
What is one most unexplainable aspect in the human body, or about the function of the human body, that you just can't scientifically or humanly completely understand or explain?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because in terms of most of the biological functions of the human body, I think they can be explained by engineering principles. And this is a major area of research by the Institute for Creation Research, is to show where how organisms adapt and how they metabolize things can be explained by engineering principles. They are readily and very well explained by that. So we need to bring more engineering into biology. And the more engineering we bring into biology, the clearer biology will become. But one area that just doesn't lend itself to engineering is where the real Randy is. What generates my thoughts, and how that relates. So there's a real Randy that all indications are that generates my thoughts. And somehow my brain becomes an interface between the real Randy and my physical body, so that my thoughts are not due to my brain. My brain does not produce my thought. My thought comes from in the immaterial realm, the spiritual realm, and it activates my brain to do the things that I want, which is really, really hard to figure out how that works. And evolutionists and naturalists have it the exact opposite. They think my brain produces my thoughts.
And it cannot be scientifically proven or disproven.
It can't be scientifically proven or disproven, and how you generate a thought. Right now we have a thought. So it begins as an immaterial thought in my mind. And then my brain activates it, I speak it, it travels over to you. You hear it, you decode it. And then your brain and then it comes into an immaterial thought in your mind. And even though I transferred information from me to you, your brain did not get any heavier. I transferred something to you, but it didn't make you heavier, bigger. It didn't change you, but there was a thought here, and now it's there. That is really, really kind of hard to figure out scientifically.
That's the soul, right? Human soul.
Yes, I would say yes. Yes, that is the soul. The soul, the real Randy is here, and I relate to you, and you're really there, and you relate to me. We do it through the physical realm, but it's like soul to soul through the physical realm, and how that connects. And someday, my heart will stop beating, my interface will stop, this body will stop, but the real Randy doesn't stop. The real Randy continues on in this immaterial realm, which is where my thoughts are right now, in the immaterial realm, expressed through the material realm to you.
Wow.
That's hard to explain scientifically.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right, let's talk about the myth about human appendix, the one that you talked about this morning. So there's this popular myth that appendix doesn't really have a purpose or has little purpose or little significance. What would you say about this right now as a scientist and as a medical doctor?
Right. I would say that what we were taught in school about the appendix was totally wrong. Evolutionary theory envisions that organs are evolving over time and that some will get better, but some maybe won't have a function. And so they saw the appendix as evidence for evolution because for a long time, scientists did not know exactly what the appendix would be doing, and they know that sometimes it gets infected and that it has to be removed surgically so people can live without your appendix. And so in their view, it fit perfectly of an organ called vestigial organ, which once had a function, but now has a diminished function, so it was good, very good evidence for evolution. That's what I was taught, and I use that as an argument for evolution myself. But now I know better. In fact, we've known for decades. I went to medical school in the early 1990s, and I was already taught in medical school that the appendix has special tissue in it, which is part of your immune system, and where it's even situated in where your small intestine connects to your large intestine serves a purpose because it can sample the contents going through, and it can help modulate the microbiome through signals in your large intestine. In addition to that, it also serves as a very important reservoir for certain bacteria that live there, and you need in your large intestine primarily in order for you to digest. And it can help seed and keep the bacteria in your large intestine as you need them. So it serves an important immunological function, even though you can live without it. But your eyes serve an important function too, even though you can live without them.
Yeah.
So the logic to think that just because you can live without something, or maybe you don't fully know its purpose, therefore we can conclude it's evolutionary, is flawed.
Do you know how it was discovered?
The
Purpose of
immunological
appendix,
purpose?
yeah.
Yes. It was discovered through basically some serious research which looks at what's called the histology, the types of cells that are in your appendix. And the cells that are in it, particularly in the inner part, are definitely part of the immune system. There, you can find them in other areas of the immune system. And then in terms of the signals and feedback it was given, that was due to some research which knocks certain things out, and you see what happens, and that's how you determine the function of this appendix.
So, and if we remove an infected appendix, then it means that, for example, if my appendix is removed, then my immune system is weakened, correct?
Well, I wouldn't use the word weakened. I would say that it's not as efficient as it would be in there. So the appendix is a structure which helps optimize the relationship between the microbes in your colon and your function with the microbes. And we really need those microbes in there, and it's part of the system which helps optimize and modulate the types of the microbes that are in your colon.
Wow. That's very interesting, because I was taught the same thing about appendix.
Right.
Yeah. Did dinosaurs really exist?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Were they in the Noah's Ark or not?
Yes, they were in Noah's Ark. Yes.
How do we know that?
Well, because we know the Bible tells us that. For one, it said all the land-breathing creatures that were not on the ark perished. And dinosaurs were, all the creatures that were air-breathing were on the ark, or they perished. And dinosaurs were land, and some others lived in other areas, but they were air-breathing animals. So if they were not on the ark, they would have perished in the flood. Mm-hmm. So they had to be brought on the ark as well. In addition to that, there is evidences that dinosaurs existed for a while after Noah landed in Ararat, and they disembarked from the ark because we have drawings which look a lot like dinosaurs. There's drawings in England, drawings in France. There's even a very fascinating carving in a temple in Cambodia that's hundreds of years old, which is a clear drawing of a stegosaurus, right there with all other kinds of animals that are on this temple, and they're animals that are living today. So there's evidence that after the flood, humans interacted with dinosaurs as well. So they were created, and they were brought onto the ark, like all the animals were. The Lord brought them to the ark. I don't know exactly how big they were or whatever. It's speculated that he brought smaller dinosaurs on the ark that would have a long lifespan and could live and reproduce in those areas. And then they lived for a period of time with humans after they got off the ark.
So there's this myth, if dinosaurs existed, they perished in the flood, that they were not brought.
Yes, that would be a myth, that all dinosaurs perished in the flood. The reality is, just like most creatures, the vast majority of dinosaurs that were alive perished. There is no doubt that the vast majority of dinosaurs were destroyed in the flood, and their fossil remains are with us to this day, and they're being uncovered every single day. And in fact, the worldwide flood is probably the best explanation for why we find these dinosaur fossils, along with other fossils as well. For one, where we find a lot of dinosaur fossils, we find them mixed up with marine creatures. So just east of here, in formations in Montana and Wyoming, you find Tyrannosaurus rex fossils, that big, terrible dinosaur, but it's also mixed in with shark fossils. So why would you find sharks, which are a marine creature, mixed in with land creatures, all buried together in the same fossil layer, along with lots of other marine creatures? So the best explanation for why we find so many fossils, billions and billions of fossils, trapped in these layers, is that the flood buried them. As the floodwaters successively covered the earth, bringing in more sediment, covering it more and more, they're trapping different layers and different zones of fossils in the fossil layer. And when we look at dinosaurs, not only do we find them buried with marine creatures, we find them buried in a pose when their bodies haven't been broken apart, which indicates that they were trapped rapidly, and they were trapped in a terrible death where they were choking on mud.
Whoa.
Choking on mud. And that's why sometimes their backs are curled backwards and their head is bent back. And we find dozens and dozens of fossils like that, indicating they're like what some call a death pose, where they're choking on mud. And then they were buried rapidly and preserved for us today.
All right. If some of the dinosaurs survived the flood, and then they probably lived for some time with people, why did they become extinct? Is there a scientific explanation to this?
Yes. So the dinosaurs that were on the ark with Noah, they did survive the flood. Dinosaurs that weren't, they didn't. So they wouldn't have survived the flood. So why did they become extinct? I can give you two probable reasons. One, there was a major change in habitat from before the flood to after the flood. And so probably like most creatures that go extinct today, there was a major change in their habitat, and they couldn't reproduce in the numbers that they need to keep their population going. And you always have to find a mate, and you have to be able to reproduce, and you have to do it to keep it going. And the second reason is also why we don't find creatures today, is that human beings hunt them to extinction. And dinosaurs, being a predator and a threat, were most likely hunted to extinction, along with the environmental changes. And that's why we don't find them today. I don't think there's the best evidence that an asteroid hit the Earth, killing just the dinosaurs or mostly just the dinosaurs, leaving all kinds of other creatures alive. That doesn't make much sense. And but what does make sense is the same reasons why we find extinction today: change of habitat, and hunting by humans to extinction.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask a really stupid question, but it's interesting, I think, to our listeners. There's this Russian fairy tale that talks about the fire-breathing dragon. Could it be the dinosaur, or like the stories about the dinosaur that could have produced that fairy tales about the fire-breathing dragon? Is there any evidence that any such dinosaurs existed, for example?
Well, the fire-breathing part, I'm not exactly sure.
Okay.
There's debate.
That's a question from one of our listeners.
Right. There's even discussion amongst creationists about the fire-breathing and what creatures can do. We know creatures can generate chemicals which can cause explosive reactions, and creatures even do this to this day. So they can cause chemical reactions which are explosive, and I don't know of any that are like the fire-breathing on that. But the dragon legends are not just in Russia. Dragon legends were around the world. There were dragon legends in the United States, or what would have been North America, not the United States, of course, at that time. In England, France, in the Mediterranean region, obviously China, since the dragon is one of their part of their calendar. And what's interesting is all the other creatures on their calendar are real life creatures that we see today. So is dragon the only myth that was just made up and then just stuck on their calendar while the other ones were real? That doesn't seem to make sense either. If the other creatures are real, why wasn't dragon also real as they related to it? So the accounts of dragons in all over the world are strong evidence that these creatures existed, and perhaps the name that we would give these creatures today is not dragon, which is an old name. We would give that name dinosaur, which is the modern name for these same kind of creatures. And you look at dragons as depicted in art, they look very similar from England and China, probably Russia as well, and they look an awful lot like dinosaurs, scales and features that are very dinosaur.
So that's probably the dinosaur.
Yes.
Well, sorry for this question.
No, that wasn't a crazy question at all. It was a good question.
So now the area of your expertise, you talk a lot about natural selection or survival of the fittest versus adaptability theory. And those theories both strive to explain the diversity and the evolution process. Why is natural selection a weak theory to believe in?
Yes. Well, natural selection is a concept. It's a way of interpreting data. And some people think it's like a real thing or a real observable process that people can actually see happening. But nobody sees nature select in any way. And so there's really a metaphysical element, a religious element to natural selection. Darwin coined the term. And Darwin was the first one to really very popularize the idea that nature can select for this or nature can select for that. And that's very misleading and it's incorrect. And it was pointed out very, very early after Darwin published his book, Origin of the Species, that to project selective abilities onto nature is a way to personify nature, to give agency to nature so that nature can act in a sense where it can act on this creature or favor this creature or disfavor that or work on. And selectionists always apply these verbs to nature, that it can weed, it can call, it can act, it can favor. And when they do that, they end up personifying it to where it becomes a creative force acting in many ways just as God would act in those areas. And Darwin knew that. And he knew that projecting selective abilities onto nature was a way to project intelligence and volition also onto nature, which are human-like, or God has those same attributes as well. He has intelligence, he has volition onto nature, so that nature is seen as a creative force. So from a spiritual sense, it's very, very misleading, because you should never project these abilities onto nature which it doesn't have. And if we took the word selection away from evolutionary explanations, they would collapse. Because that is the only force they have to get something that can act in the stead of God. And I can explain the exact same phenomena without ever using the magical phrase natural selection and projecting magic into biology. I can clearly see that organisms produce traits. I can see that organisms produce traits that solve problems. I can see that organisms reproduce, and I can see that their offspring inherit some of these traits. I can see everything that organisms can do as if they're designed to solve problems and filled various niches. So I just described to you what we really observe. We see some organisms solve problems. When they do, they fill those niches. And some organisms that don't solve the problems, they stay where they are, or some of them may die. But I just explained to you how variation happens, and I never invoked a magical selective force and projected selective ability onto nature.
Would it be like the environment, like very cold environment, and the weaker organisms die and the stronger organisms live, and that's how natural selection happens?
Well, that's how they would say it happens.
Yeah.
But when we talk about weaker and stronger organisms, what we're talking about there are their traits.
Yeah.
Their traits and their abilities to solve challenges or to not
So
solve
the traits
challenges.
are in the organism,
The
but
traits
not.
are in the organism, and that's where we should be looking to answer the question, why did this organism live and why did this organism die, or why did this organism have more offspring and this one had less offspring? We should not be looking to the environment and project onto its selective abilities. You look to the organism and you look at where its traits are and what traits are solving problems, and you look at the genetics or epigenetic explanation to explain those traits. And if you look to the organism, science will stay on track. Science will be looking at the right place to find the right explanations for why certain organisms thrive in certain environments and why other organisms don't. But as soon as you start projecting magical abilities onto nature to favor, act on, select, one, that's magic, so we don't like it. Two, it pretty much stops investigation, and I read so many scientific papers. As soon as they say trait was selected for or nature favored it, investigation ends. They've come up with their explanation. But a real engineer would say that makes no sense. We would look at what about the creature is succeeding to solve these problems? What traits are working? How are the traits working together? And what is in the organism to express those traits? And you continue the investigation on to explain how it's working. That's why being liberated from natural selection is not only good theologically, it's very good scientifically.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have just a couple more questions, and I'll switch gears. Let's talk about, you are a medical doctor and we are in the middle of pandemic, and there are a lot of different views on pandemic, and I don't want to debate any of them, but I just want to hear your perspective or your take on pandemic, what's happening to us and how it's affecting churches around the world and why.
Oh yeah, well that's a really hot button question in churches and things today, and it's unfortunate because the earth has experienced pandemics many times in the past, and they have never become as politicized as this pandemic. And it appears to me that certain groups of people are using the pandemic in order to advance political agendas and get control over people that never happened in the past. And because of that, the information that everybody gets can be skewed, it can be biased in one ways. In fact, even as a medical doctor, as I read certain data, I'm wondering, has this been biased? Has somebody been manipulating the data in some way in order to get an outcome or something that is going to advance their agenda? But I do know certain things. One, the pandemic is real. Many, many, many people have died from it. And I had a very close friend just this week die of COVID. And so people are really dying from that. And as a medical doctor, what I really want to do is prevent a bad outcome, which is to get very sick and have long-term consequences, or even worse, to die from that. And so what we really need to be focusing on as medical professionals is the way to prevent the bad outcome, and not pushing anything which is not necessarily going to do that. So what I do know is this, that COVID is real, that a lot of people get it and they recover from it. And then they develop an immune response to it. And the best evidence indicates that the natural immunity that people get from COVID is the best defense. It's broader, it's, as you use the word you use, it's stronger, and it appears to last longer.
Do we know how long it lasts?
No, don't know. There's some indications that people who were infected with COVID in the past, because COVID was a common respiratory virus around even before COVID-19 was, that they've had antibodies that have lasted at least a decade from when they had COVID in the past, and it seemed to be protective against this COVID infection, even though there's various variants. There's different variants of this. We had the Alpha variant, and now we're in the Delta variant. It looks like there's another one coming on called the R1 variant. Oh no, nobody wants to hear about another variant there. But there's indications that people who had COVID exposures a long time ago still had some protection. So I'm confident that people who have had COVID with the Alpha or Delta and who have recovered will probably have immunological protection against other things. It doesn't mean they can't get sick, but it indicates they probably won't get as sick in the past. Then that brings up the question about the vaccine. What's really dividing people on the vaccine is the mandate, the forced vaccination. Not that there's a vaccine. It's one, it's the mandate, and then two, some misinformation about the vaccine, of which I hear a lot of questions coming to me asking, will this vaccine change your DNA? And the answer is no, it won't.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's not going to change your DNA.
Yeah.
And in fact, the vaccine doesn't even have DNA. It has a little tiny snippet of RNA that when your cells absorb it, they express the spike protein, and it looks like your body has been infected with it, and then your body develops antibodies to it. And so it's not going to change your DNA in that way. Will it protect you? Yes. It will protect you from getting COVID. Will it protect you from having serious disease? Yes. Very much so. Will it protect you from possibly dying from it? Yes, very much so. So if you want to avoid a bad outcome and you've not had previous infection, then the vaccine is a good way to get that protection. What we should be asking people, and we should be checking for people, is do they have antibodies? Do they have antibodies either from the vaccine, or do they have antibodies from a natural infection? If you have antibodies, you're much less likely to get COVID and much less likely to get very sick and die. If you don't, you're at risk. And so we should not be forcing people to take the vaccine if they already have natural immunity on it.
So I've had COVID in March 2020, and I had a severe case, a bad case, and I have antibodies now. Should I get a vaccine?
My recommendation is no. If I knew exactly how long the antibodies would last and that they were going to wane over a short period of time, I'd say yes, a vaccine could boost it. But there doesn't seem to be indication that the natural antibodies are waning very fast, that they seem to be there. There also is some indications in the literature that the people who have had a bad reaction are people who have probably had COVID and recovered from it, and then just like they have a more severe reaction to their second inoculation than they did the first, perhaps these bad reactions, not all of them, but many, were people who were previously infected and recovered from that. So I think that really the prudent thing to do is not force everyone to get a vaccine. It's to check for the antibodies, and that's what we're after. We want to protect people. If they don't have the antibodies, offer them the vaccination as a way to protect them and a way to develop antibodies, because we don't know who's going to have a bad outcome. So the best thing to do is prevent people from getting COVID to begin with. And the vaccine will do that. But we don't want to be giving people a vaccine if they already have antibodies to it.
Because there's going to be, could be a severe reaction?
There could be a severe reaction.
Why is that?
Well,
if I have antibodies and then I have a vaccine, why will I have a severe reaction?
Because you're already, what causes a lot of the problem with COVID is not per se the infection itself, but your body's response to it. And the body's response is what we would call exuberant, or it can even get out of control. And so you already are primed to have a response, and then we give you something else to evoke another response. And therefore, you could set you up to possibly have clots or other things as well, which are a side effect of this. So you don't want to get the COVID, but you also don't want to have your body have an over response to the COVID, which is also causing a lot of the disease. And probably many of the deaths is your body's overreaction to the COVID as well. So one of the ways that we treat COVID is you try to help control that immune response so that it doesn't get out of hand.
So why is the mandate then? Is it purely political then, or?
Well, I think there's a strong political component to it as well. Are there people who are for the mandate because of very good intentions? Probably. There's some people who are really strong for the mandate because they don't want people to get sick and die. And so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they just want the good outcome for everybody as well. There's probably a part that is very political in order to kind of get some control over people as well. And people can see that by the threats and the harsh retribution that happens to people without it. So there's people who have good intentions. There's people probably who just want conformity. Both are probably working together for them to try to have a mandate.
Thank you so much for this. I know it's kind of like an extra
Yeah, that's all right. Was that clear?
Question. Yeah, very clear. And thank you. It's an extra question to our interview. I was just curious. I thought I'd use your medical knowledge to help our listeners. There's a lot of misunderstandings and myths going around. So imagine that you have a chance to address thousands of people who believe in Darwin's theory around the world. What would you say to them in 1 minute?
If I had 60 seconds, I would say Darwinian theory is a very poor scientific theory, and the things that you've learned in your textbook are generally wrong, and they should have been eliminated from your textbook years ago, but they're kept there because there's an agenda by the textbook people and by many scientists to promote this worldview. Why would they promote the worldview? Because it is the only alternative explanation for why organisms look so intelligently designed. We look at creatures, they look intelligently designed. The natural explanation is to say they were designed. They were designed by an omnipotent God who really knows what he's doing. Darwinian evolution came by to offer an alternative explanation for design, and that's why it stays around. If evolutionists can come up with another way, or somebody else could come up with another way to explain design, I believe evolution would be kicked off the stage because the evidence for it is weak. The evidence for it is circumstantial. A lot of holes are filled in with imagination, and it has had a bad outcome on science everywhere it has gone over the last decades. We have a better possibility of explaining biological functions by looking at creatures as if they were highly engineered and studying them from a reverse engineering fashion.
Thank you for this amazing interview, and thank you for your time.
No, you're more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you
much. And thank you for letting me have this opportunity to talk to so many people.
Thank you.
And as an American, I always got the opinion that the government in the Soviet Union lied to the people.
Oh, yeah.
All the time. Just lie about productivity, lie about this.
And that's a proven fact now, so we know.
And but I now appreciate how our government lies to us. all the time.
Yeah.
And that maybe that's what governments do. They just,
But there are so many people alive like you are who lived during those times, during the Cold War, when they were afraid of the Soviet Union and the communist scare.
Right.
Why do you think there are not enough of those people who would like stand against it? Or
well, you have to have an accurate view of history. And when you change people's understanding of history, you change how they think of themselves in the present, and then you change what they see in the future. And there's a book, 1984, which is written.
Yeah.
You know, he who controls the present controls the past, because you can rewrite the history. You can rewrite in the present the history of the past. And when you change people's understanding of their past, you change where they're going to go in the future. And so by rewriting history and not having like a total accurate history of the communist reign, not just in the Soviet Union, but in other places, and not having an accurate history of the United States and almost reversing the histories, you can get people not liking the system in the United States and longing for the system in the Soviet Union by just changing the history on those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So
it's crazy.
it is crazy. And then you get people in the United States who are ashamed of their past. And if all you do is bring up in a country your mistakes that you've made, and you never talk about the good things that the country's done, and you just keep mistake, even though a country might have done many, many good things, and then you end up with young people ashamed of being who they are.
Exactly.
Instead of being proud of who they are. And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's why, as Christians, we need to do a better job of teaching our young people of our Christian heritage, of many men and women who stood up against tyranny and stood for their faith, and they were even persecuted for their faith, even to their death. And we need to teach that so that our young Christians are proud of who they were. And we need to teach about Christians who went overseas and built colleges, universities, hospitals, orphanages, and all kinds of educational institutes and all kinds of other things which helped people out when they were poor and downtrodden and didn't get education, other things like this. Christians did that more than anybody.
Yeah, for some reason, we don't hear about that.
We don't hear about
it.
But there were thousands and thousands of Christians who went around the world doing all of this. And we really should be very, very proud in a good way of our Christian heritage, because Christians have done so much good in this world, and we need our young people to know that too.